Welcome to Mystery Con. Glad to have you back. They uncovered patterns no one was supposed to find. And now, something is following. Strange signals, erased files, vanishing people. It's all connected. Let's unravel today's mystery. I was just a data analyst on a civilian oceanic monitoring contract. Nothing heroic. My name is David Rourke. I wasn't some government agent or ex-military whistleblower, just a quiet analyst in a windowless office overlooking the North Atlantic. My job was to comb through ship telemetry, weather logs and transponder signals for insurance companies, mostly old freight logs and maritime drift corrections. Boring, repetitive work, the kind you can do with half a brain while streaming crime. Podcasts, nothing ever happened, until Flight 709 vanished mid-transit. That night, I flagged a sonar anomaly, just a tiny spike, like a stutter in the data. Seconds before the plane's signal blinked off the grid, I noted it, flagged it in the system, and moved on. But something about the waveform kept gnawing at me. It wasn't mechanical noise, and it didn't match any known marine traffic signature. I looped the file again and again. There was a rhythm to it, subtle, pulsing, almost like language. When I brought it up to my supervisor, he shrugged. I'd often told me to stick to quantifiables, but I didn't let it go. I ran it against archived data, and that's when things got weird. The same sonar pattern popped up in 3 old disappearances. Freighters in the 90s, a French oceanic survey drone in 2004, and a US naval prototype from 2017. Different decades, different missions, but all inside a rough triangle, Newfoundland to Scotland to a deep trench east of Greenland. My skin prickled the moment I realized it. A pattern. I started logging everything, cross-referencing weather conditions, satellite data, even seismic logs. That's when my access started vanishing. One by one, directories I'd used for years began returning permission denied. At first, I thought it was a bug. Then I noticed files disappearing from my local cache, ones I had opened days earlier. The audit log was blank. I asked around, but no one else had seen anything strange. That was the first moment doubt cracked through me, not about the anomaly, but about my own memory. Had I misfiled the logs? Dreamed up the matches. I started second-guessing everything, until the package arrived. No return address, just a USB drive in a manila envelope left under my windshield wiper. On it, 6 files labeled Thresher 1983, coordinates, sonar graphs, 1 distorted audio file. That's when I stopped sleeping, because whatever was buried out there, beneath that trench, was never meant to be found. I waited 3 days before opening the USB drive. I kept it wrapped in aluminum foil, tucked behind the lining of my desk drawer, like it might leak something if left exposed. When I finally plugged it in, I did it from a burner laptop in a cafe 5 miles from my apartment, using a VPN tunneled through a VPN. Paranoia had already become second nature. The files were clean, no malware, no traceable metadata. Just raw data folders, deep-sea sonar spectrograms, Cold War-era shipping logs, and 6 audio files labeled by date. The oldest one, Thresher 83.1.wav, was barely a whisper, mostly static. But beneath the noise was something low and mechanical, like pressure grinding through a hull. The second file was worse. Voices, distant and garbled, panicking over the comms. Then a sharp, metallic shriek, followed by complete silence. I listened to all of them. Whatever recorded these sounds wasn't civilian. It felt like black project data, something recorded far below operational depth. The documents in the folder backed that up, declassified only in format, not in truth. Pages scanned from aging faxes referenced unmapped trenches, anomalous currents, and unauthorized naval dives. A few names were redacted, others left exposed. One in particular kept showing up, Dr. Ansel Roth, a geophysicist attached to something called Marinex. I'd never heard of it. I tried searching it through institutional directories, but nothing came up. No citations, no references, no funding trails. It didn't exist, at least not in any official capacity. That same day, my work login failed. It said my credentials had been deactivated. They had no explanation. I checked my badge, still active, but it wouldn't open the door when I returned to the office. A colleague I trusted, Jen, told me quietly that HR had flagged my file for internal audit, which she'd never heard of before. She looked scared just talking to me. That night, I found my apartment door open. Nothing taken. Just the USB drive gone. No signs of forced entry. The lock wasn't broken. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark, listening for sounds that didn't belong. The silence was heavier than it should have been. Whatever I'd touched wasn't forgotten. It was protected. The next morning, I drove 2 hours north without a plan. I avoided highways, paid cash for gas, and switched off my phone. The USB drive was gone, but the files weren't. I'd made copies, 2 encrypted backups, one hidden in cloud storage, the other stored offline in a portable SSD taped inside a hollowed-out travel mug. I stopped at a diner near the coast, ordered coffee, and opened my laptop. One folder stood out among the others. It was labeled Disp Log A7, and I hadn't noticed it before. Inside were short video clips, grainy black and white footage from what looked like submarine cameras. Each showed the same sequence: murky depths, then a sudden rupture in the water. Not an explosion, not collapse, something stranger. The water folded in on itself like glass warping under heat. In one clip, a metallic object flickered into view and vanished in less than a second. I paused and rewound the frame. It looked like a piece of equipment, structured, symmetrical, but nothing I recognized. In the final clip, a timestamp read June E. 18th, 1983, 0347 UTC. The frame was still until a faint pulse disrupted it, followed by a burst of static. Then the video ended. I checked the coordinates listed in the metadata. Same triangle, green land, trench, eastern edge. Whoever compiled these files had access to deep-sea operations I'd never seen referenced in any open archive. I tried searching for Disp Log A7 in scientific repositories. Nothing. I searched Marinex again. Still no results, but a forum thread buried in an old oceanic researcher board caught my attention. A user named Calm Spiral had posted about a 1980s Arctic anomaly linked to untraceable magnetic pulses and displacement phenomena. Most users dismissed it as fringe speculation, but one reply stood out. It simply said, "You're looking for Roth. Try Oslo. Ask for Station Grey." I screenshotted everything. Then I powered down the laptop, paid my bill, and left. I didn't know anyone in Oslo, but I knew I had to go. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever Roth had studied wasn't geological, it was spatial. Something not meant to be measured, something designed to move things, people, maybe, out of reach. I landed in Oslo under heavy skies. The airport felt colder than it should have in late spring, and every voice around me sounded distant, like I was underwater. I moved quickly, avoiding eye contact, clutching a single carry-on with nothing but my laptop, documents, and the backup drive. I hadn't booked a hotel. I didn't want a record. Instead, I found a hostel on the edge of the city, cash only, no ID required. That night, I searched for any reference to Station Grey. Most results were dead links or irrelevant military jargon. I tried local networks, Norwegian archives, even university servers. Nothing. But one article mentioned a now-defunct listening post in the early 80s buried in the highlands west of Lillehammer. It had been run by a joint Nordic defence group during the Cold War. No formal name was listed, just a code name, Grey Station. I rented a car the next morning and headed inland. The roads narrowed as I climbed through dense pine forests. By early afternoon I found what remained, a rusted chain-link fence and a concrete hatch half hidden beneath moss and brush. There were no markings, no warnings, nothing official, just a forgotten slab in the middle of nowhere. I climbed over the fence and forced the hatch open with a crowbar I'd bought from a roadside hardware shop. The stairs descended into darkness. My flashlight caught glimpses of corroded steel walls, cables running like veins along the ceiling. The air was still. Not stale, still. I moved slowly, careful not to make sound. At the end of the corridor, I found a control room. Dust coated the consoles, but someone had been here recently. A thermos sat half full on the desk. Warm. On the far wall, a corkboard held yellowed maps of the North Atlantic Trench. Red string connected dots. My triangle. I heard footsteps above. Slow, deliberate. Someone else was here. I didn't move. I held my breath and backed into a shadowed corner, laptop clutched against my chest. The footsteps paused at the top of the stairwell. Then, one by one, they began to descend. Whoever built this place hadn't abandoned it, and neither had whoever found it after them. I stayed frozen in the shadows, barely breathing. The steps were slow but confident, like whoever was coming down knew the place well. No flashlight, just the soft shuffle of boots against concrete. I backed deeper into the corner behind a rusted equipment rack, laptop pressed tight against my ribs. Then a voice, low and unhurried, echoed down the stairwell. "If you're here for Roth, you're already late." I didn't answer. The man stepped into view, backlit by the faint daylight above. He was older, late 50s maybe, dressed in a worn parka and thick wool gloves. He didn't look military, but he didn't look lost either. He walked past the hatch and scanned the control room like he'd done it 100 times. "I saw your rental outside," he said calmly. "Silver Skoda. No local plate. Cheap surveillance. Technique." He finally turned and looked straight at me. "You don't look like an operative. Not yet." I stepped forward slowly, careful not to appear a threat. "I'm not with anyone," I said. "I just want to understand what this place is." He studied me for a moment, then nodded toward the corkboard. "You already know more than most, but you're missing the point." I asked him if he knew Roth. His expression darkened. I knew him. Everyone on the list did. Scientists, analysts, engineers, people who saw something they couldn't explain and tried to quantify it anyway. He moved toward the map and tapped a red pin near the trench's deepest edge. "We called it the displacement zone, not just magnetic shifts, not just sonar interference, something structural, like reality buckling under pressure." I opened my laptop and pulled up one of the old sonar files. When I played the audio, the man flinched. "That sound," he said, "isn't from this side. It's bleed-through, echoes from wherever they go when they vanish." I asked who they were, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he pulled a weathered notebook from his coat. Inside were names, dozens of them. Roth's list. Most were crossed out. In the corner of one page was a small mark I hadn't noticed at first, a triangle with a slash through it. The exact symbol etched into the label of the USB drive I'd received. My stomach turned. This man, or someone he knew, had sent it. Everyone who's investigated this has disappeared, been discredited, or gone silent, he said, except me, and now you. He handed me the notebook. If you're serious, there's one place left, but you'll have to go under. The man gave no name. He simply handed me the notebook, turned, and climbed the stairs without another word. I didn't follow. I stayed in the control room, flipping through the pages, coordinates, names, handwritten notes in shorthand. One entry was boxed in red ink. Deep ice facility, Sector K4, Nord Station. Use tunneling access, not main gates. I searched for Nord Station that night in a small cafe back in town, running queries through satellite maps and outdated defense databases. It didn't show on modern charts, but an old Scandinavian logistics map from 1996 marked it faintly, in the upper reaches of Greenland's eastern shelf. It had once supported Arctic climate research, officially decommissioned in 2002. I booked passage on a supply ship the next day under a false name. From there, I paid a local guide to take me the rest of the way by snowcrawler. It took 14 hours through whiteout conditions. When we arrived, I saw the station buried beneath ice and wind-carved snow. No signs of power, no tracks, no footprints. My guide wouldn't stay. He left as soon as he dropped me off. I found the secondary hatch half submerged behind a collapsed drift. It took nearly an hour to dig through. The steel door was frozen shut. I used a portable torch to melt the seal, then pried it open. As I approached the hatch, I glanced up out of habit. The sky was overcast, but I caught a brief glint of movement, too steady to be a bird, too fast to be wind-blown snow. Possibly a drone. I turned away quickly and entered the stairwell. If someone was watching, they already knew where I was. The interior was pitch black, the air dry and stale. I descended with a headlamp, following a narrow stairwell into a pressure-sealed corridor. Power was dead, but the structure held. Reinforced walls, labeled terminals, intact signage. I followed hand-marked arrows left behind by someone who had clearly come before me. They led to a reinforced vault door. Next to it, a control panel had been disassembled and rewired. I bridged 2 exposed wires with a key from the notebook's back cover. A strange copper stub labeled PSH link. The door groaned open. Inside was a chamber unlike the rest. Newer tech, clean. A faint hum from a hidden generator suggested it was running on an isolated backup loop, likely geothermal, buried deep enough to avoid satellite detection. Screens lit up as I entered, showing live sonar feeds from the trench. One screen displayed data in real time. I watched the numbers shift, not randomly, but rhythmically, like something beneath the ice was responding. And then one word appeared on the center monitor. Received. I stared at the screen as the word slowly pulsed. Received. The signal wasn't just outbound, it had been acknowledged. The chamber felt different now, not just cold, but charged, like static, clinging to my skin. I moved carefully between the consoles, scanning for logs or files that could explain what had responded. One terminal showed a series of transmissions sent from this station, fragments of sonar bursts, encrypted pings, even voice clips. The most recent one was time-stamped less than a week ago. Someone had been here before me. I opened the file. A voice, calm, measured, spoke in Norwegian, then English. Initiating final sequence.
Target zone aligned. Awaiting confirmation. No name, no other details. Just those words. Then silence. Beneath that, a data stream was running live, cycling through coordinates locked within the trench. I recognized them. The same ones from...
Roth's earliest notes. The epicenter. My breath fogged in the air as I approached a final console labeled Gateway Monitor. A diagram on the screen displayed a field distortion, like folded space mapped in 3 dimensions. Pulses flickered on the grid in precise intervals. It wasn't random, it was patterned, repeating like a countdown. I backed away, heart pounding. Whatever this place had been built for, it hadn't stopped. I checked the notebook again, flipping to the last page. Roth's final entry was short. Entry is the only proof. Recovery is impossible, but observation isn't enough anymore.
I stood there for a long time, staring at that sentence.
Then I made a decision. I activated the final relay. The chamber vibrated gently, then stabilized. The screen shifted. A tunnel camera came online, revealing a long corridor descending deeper beneath the facility. The hatch at the far end opened.
On its own. My hands trembled, but I walked forward, one step at a time. The lights flickered as I moved through the passage. Then everything fell silent. No wind, no sound, just a pressure in the air like gravity bending inward. At the end of...
The hall was a second door, marked only with a single word, Thresher. I opened it. There was no light inside, only a soft hum, like a memory playing back from underwater. Then everything shifted, and I was gone. The email wasn't flagged as urgent, but it should have been. A junior technician at a Scandinavian telecom satellite hub had attached the usual data dump from a passive underwater relay off the eastern Greenland shelf. Routine anomaly checks, seismic noise, fishing activity, temperature shifts. I almost deleted it. Then I saw the waveform. It matched nothing in our system, not a creature, not a fault line. It was structured. I ran a harmonic analysis. The pattern, repeated every 11 minutes, intermittent but intentional. I checked the source location twice. It came from inside the trench, coordinates I'd only seen in outdated NATO field maps buried on defense servers. That was the first thing that made my hands shake. The second was the audio. I isolated the signal from the noise, looped it, slowed it down. At first it was just static and low pulses. Then, after the third loop, I heard a voice. Warped, delayed, but human. It said a name. David. Rourke. The voice dragged like it was being pulled underwater, syllables slurring, distorting across some impossible medium. But it was there. I searched for the name. Nothing official. No records. No paper trail. But I found fragments, references in conspiracy threads, an old encrypted blog with 3 dead links, one forum post archived from 8 years ago. It just said, if you hear it, don't answer back. I closed my laptop. My office was quiet. No windows. I stared at the monitor, the signal still pulsing like a heartbeat. Whatever was down there, it hadn't stopped. It wasn't lost. It was waiting, and it had started to speak. I came to Loch Kailech for silence. After the divorce, I needed a place where the only voices were wind and water. My name's Dr. Isla Morven, marine ecologist, and recently single, though neither title fits as well as I'd like. The eco-research. Residency offered isolation disguised as purpose, a monitoring post for aquatic life, in a loch too remote for tourists, too deep for easy answers. They said there was a legend here, something about a loch beast that old fishermen swore.
Buying kids joked about.
I didn't care. I came for water samples, sonar mapping, and to be left alone. That changed the moment I heard the pulse. It happened late one night during a routine hydrophone check. I was alone in the lab, half listening to baseline recordings, sipping cheap tea gone cold. That's when I caught it, an ultra-low frequency, subsonic and pulsing like a heartbeat. It wasn't machine noise, not the clatter of trawlers or the drone of passing aircraft. It was organic, patterned, and impossible. It moved. I tracked it, shifting through depths at speeds no known aquatic creature could match. At first, I thought it was an equipment error. I ran diagnostics, the gear was fine. I logged the anomaly and told the team in the morning. They smiled, nodded, and said nothing. Later, one of them pulled me aside, Dr. Mallory, a limnologist with the Crown-linked survey division. She whispered, "Don't chase ghosts," and walked away like it meant something more. I didn't let it go. I started comparing current recordings to archived logs from the 90s Crown expeditions, old hydroacoustic charts redacted in places, smeared with black ink, and bureaucratic vagueness. I cross-referenced what I could salvage and found it. The same frequency signature, identical to the one I recorded, buried in a sonar scan labeled inconclusive biological artifact. There was a timestamp and a Navy vessel listed in the margin. No mission, no explanation. That was the mental trigger. Something was here, something old, something that didn't want to be found, or worse, was never meant to be. I stopped sleeping well. I started noticing how many Crown research files were marked confidential, how many logs had missing hours. When I asked, I was told to stick to environmental analysis. But that pulse, that low, steady rhythm, I still hear it sometimes.
Even when the hydrophones are turned off. I came here to disappear. Instead, I found something that never left. I stopped trusting the lab's main server the week after the pulse.
The system started behaving oddly, lagging, crashing during file transfers, dropping live recordings midstream. I backed everything up to an encrypted drive and started keeping a handwritten log, just in case. When I asked our IT liaison about the outages, he brushed it off as infrastructure fatigue. That might have passed as an answer if it hadn't coincided with the deletion of my most recent spectrogram comparisons. Entire folders vanished, wiped without trace. No access.
Logs, no recovery point, just gone. That's when I began checking the older hydrophone stations on my own.
Most were rarely used anymore, outdated and partly corroded, but a few still functioned if I brought my own receiver. Late one night, I took the skiff out alone, a 2-hour drift toward the lock's deepest point. The surface was glass flat. No wind, no boat traffic, just the dull slap of water against the hull. I dropped the hydrophone and listened through a pair of over-ear monitors patched to my recorder. For 20 minutes, nothing. Then it started again, the same subsonic pulse, but this time closer, louder, not in decibels but in presence. I could feel it in my ribs, a low thrum that blurred the line between sound and sensation. It moved, in staggered arcs like it was circling, tracking me in slow revolutions beneath the boat. I turned off the recorder, sat still, held my breath. Then it stopped. I pulled up the gear and left in silence, not even daring to start the motor until I drifted a safe distance from the site. Back at the lab, I reviewed the waveform. It wasn't just noise. There was a signature now, a secondary rhythm overlaid.
On the original pulse, like a feedback loop or echo, except deliberate.
Almost patterned. I showed it to Mallory the next day. She stared for a long time and said nothing. Then she folded her arms and asked where I'd recorded it. When I told her, she said something that stuck with me. That grid square hasn't shown fish movement in 3 years, dead zone. Dead zones don't move, but this one had, and it had come looking. 2 days after the drift recording, Crown's sonar team arrived unannounced. They didn't check in through the station's public log. I found out when I passed their vessel, moored in a far cove, mostly hidden behind a tree line. The ship wasn't marked with standard marine tags, no research insignia, no ID numbers, just matte grey steel and a black radar dome. I asked Mallory about it. She looked uneasy and said they were routine contractors. But routine teams don't dive with blackout gear. Later that evening, I watched from the shoreline as a diver was lowered into the water under low light. No comms chatter, no sonar pings, just silence. I noted the time and grid location in my log, then returned to the lab, trying to shake the rising discomfort in my chest. The next morning, I found Mallory alone in the mess hall. She looked tired, her coffee untouched. "One of their divers didn't come back," she said without preamble. "They're saying equipment failure."
No body, no signal, just gone. I asked if a report had been filed. She shook her head. "There won't be one." She slid a note across the table, handwritten, creased, water-stained. His girlfriend came to me, said he called her
From the boat before the dive, said he saw something on a sonar test the day before, said it wasn't a shape, it was movement, a mass like a ship, blinking with red light. Said it watched him. I took the note and read it twice. The last line chilled me. It knew we were listening. I tried contacting a colleague back. In British Columbia, someone who had experience with anomalous marine bioacoustics. My email bounced. Then the lab server crashed again. This time, my personal archive went with it. Weeks of notes, gone. That night, I backed up everything to paper. I printed spectrograms, transcribed timestamps by hand, and sealed copies in waterproof bags. Something was erasing the trail behind me, something with reach. I checked the tide logs before bed and saw a new anomaly, another dead zone, further north, where the river feeds in. It hadn't been there 3 days ago. It was moving again and getting closer. I started sleeping in the lab. It felt safer surrounded by equipment, closer to the data, harder to interfere with. Every night, I checked my hydrophones manually, bypassing the network entirely. I wrote everything down, double-logged each entry, then photographed the pages, and mailed copies to an old post office box I hadn't touched in years. It was precaution turning into routine, and routine into paranoia. But I couldn't afford mistakes now, not with something circling the loch and the story folding in on itself. A Crown technician approached me the next morning, young, polite, and strangely vague. He said they were upgrading their mobile sonar arrays and asked if I'd like to
observe. I said no. That afternoon, I noticed someone had entered my bunk while I was out on the water. Nothing was stolen, but the air smelled different, like metal and cologne. My journal had been moved, just slightly, but enough to notice.
I didn't say anything. I installed a trail camera facing the door and kept my backup drive with me at all times, even during field work. That evening, Mallory came by with a bottle of whiskey and a warning. "They're watching you now," she said, quiet and certain. "They know you saw the echo pattern. They know you've been syncing the dead zones to sonar paths." I asked why she was telling me this. She looked away, then said, "Because I saw it too, years ago. We buried the data, told ourselves it was noise, but it wasn't. It was something real." I asked her what happened. She hesitated. A mentor of mine tried to go public, got discredited, quietly removed. Last I heard, he lived in a trailer up north off-grid, and they said he was unstable. I asked if she thought he was wrong. She shook her head. He just talked too loud. The loch had gone quiet again, No fish movement, no birds near the waterline. The pulse wasn't gone, it was dormant, like something holding its breath. I left a hydrophone recording overnight and set up a motion-triggered camera just above. The shoreline, if it surfaced, even briefly, I'd catch it. But when I checked the footage the next morning, the card was blank, not deleted, blank as if nothing had been recorded at all. Not even wind, not even time. News of the missing diver never made it beyond the camp. No announcements, no memorial, just silence and reassigned shifts. But people felt it. Conversation stopped when I entered a room. Equipment I requested took longer to arrive, if it arrived at all. I kept my head down and kept working. Mallory was the only one who still spoke to me without hesitation. One evening, she handed me a slip of paper with a name and a pub address, 3 towns over. "Go tonight," she said. "He drinks after close. Ask him about 1992. I drove out in the rain, parked around the corner, and waited until the pub emptied. The place was quiet inside, dim, wood-panelled, half-forgotten. I found the man in the back booth, alone, with a glass of brown liquor and a face that had seen too many winters. I told him who I was, where I worked, and what I'd heard. He didn't ask how I got his name. He just stared into his glass and said, "It wasn't supposed to live." He told me about a program, biotech trials in the early 90s. Gene-spliced marine species tested in oxygen-poor environments, designed to adapt, to survive, where others failed. They picked closed locks for containment, he said. No public access, easy oversight, and the Crown needed test beds. I asked what species. He said they started with eels, something about their regenerative traits and neural plasticity. But they changed fast, too fast. I asked why no one stopped it. He laughed. "Tourism," he said. "People liked the monster story. It kept eyes looking the wrong way." I asked what happened to the eels. His face darkened. They got big. They got smart. We couldn't tag them. Nets didn't work. Then the sonar team stopped trying. Their job changed. Keep them in, not study them. Before I left, I asked why he was telling me any of this. He looked at me like I already knew. "Because you've heard it, haven't you? That sound, it's not just movement. It's watching." I drove back in silence. Rain covered the road, like mist. And in the stillness I realized I hadn't checked the hydrophone logs in nearly 24 hours. I felt something tighten in my chest. I already knew what I'd find. I returned to the lab just after midnight. The place was dark, silent, colder than usual. I skipped the main server and went straight to my offline recorder. It blinked red. Full memory. That shouldn't have been possible. I hadn't left it running. I pulled the drive, plugged it into my laptop, and scanned the files. All time stamped within a 3-hour window, no breaks, no gaps, but the metadata said otherwise. It logged activity starting 2 minutes before I returned. I put on headphones and hit play. At first, static, then the pulse. Slower now, more. Spaced out but layered with something else. A clicking rhythm, erratic but purposeful, like coded language. It built slowly, then dropped away in an instant. What followed made my skin crawl. A low groan, deep and wet, dragged across the recording, like it came from just beneath the surface.
Not mechanical, not weather, something alive. I checked the GPS tag. The recorder had been moved. It was no longer at the northern inlet where I'd placed it. It had been dragged 70 meters southeast, directly into a mapped dead zone.
Someone, or something, had gone down there. I packed my gear, took the backup drive, and left without waking anyone. I reached the inlet at first light. The water was flat, almost oily. I lowered a tethered camera and fed the line out slowly. Visibility was poor. Silt swirled in dense spirals, disturbed by something recent. I reached the bottom depth and scanned the feed. There was no sign of the recorder. Then something shifted on screen, just a flicker, a shape, too close, sliding past the frame. I froze the video and enhanced the still, a smooth arc, almost flesh-like, with a faint reflection, no scales, no fins, and just at the edge, something resembling an eye, not round, vertical. I yanked the camera back up, checked the tether, and found the last meter frayed, almost melted. Back at the lab, the Crown team was already there, parked and waiting. No questions, just silence. Mallory caught my eye, then looked away. That evening, my internet connection dropped to 0. My email credentials were revoked, my university access suspended. The message was clear. This wasn't research anymore. It was containment. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the lab, back against the wall, gear packed and ready. Every few minutes, I checked the logs. No new data, no movement, just silence. At dawn, I made a decision. I would retrieve the original hydrophone, my first recorder, still anchored near the southern trench. If anything had real proof, it was that unit. I launched before anyone noticed, took the skiff alone, following the shoreline until I reached the shelf. The water looked wrong, slick, opaque, the way oil glazes a tide pool after rain. I anchored and descended. Visibility collapsed past 10 meters. The lock swallowed light like a shutter closing. I followed the line by touch, fingers numb. At 15 meters, I found the hydrophone, still logging. I reached for it and stopped. There was something beside it, not touching, hovering. It drifted with purpose, slow and soundless, larger than the hull of the skiff above. It didn't reflect light, it warped it. Not a cloak, not camouflage, more like light curved around it, unwilling. Then I saw it move, not swimming, turning. Something shifted inside my chest. Not fear, recognition. Like it had seen me before, like it remembered. I yanked the unit and kicked upward, broke surface, breath burning. The skiff rocked, and for a moment I thought I saw it breach. Just a glimpse, a ridge of pale flesh rising in the distance before slipping back under. No wake, no splash, like it was showing me something. When I reached shore, Crown vans were already waiting. But they weren't parked at the lab. They were outside Mallory's cabin. I saw 2 men lead her out, one holding her by the arm. She didn't fight. She just stared at me, calm, defeated. The door slammed behind her, and that was the last I saw of her. Back in the lab, my access had been revoked, email locked, drive wiped. They didn't take the recorder. I had hidden it beneath the water tank. But when I opened it, the data was gone, not corrupted, rewritten, blank files, time stamped with future dates. Whatever was in that trench didn't just survive, it adapted, it erased. That night, I mailed physical notes to 5 outlets. 2 were returned. One editor resigned, another was replaced. The last copy I left under a bridge in Glasgow. If no one believes me, fine. But I know now. It isn't a legend, it isn't lost. It's still down there, awake and watching, and it doesn't need to hide anymore. Before we uncover the next secret, subscribe, and let me know how your day's going. Every message matters. Let's continue. I wasn't supposed to find her voice, buried under the wrong call number in a collapsing wing of the Library of Congress. But once I heard it, Everything else stopped mattering. My name's Ellis Rourke, documentary editor, mostly archival. I specialize in stitching together the past for people who don't care about it. It was a Thursday, late spring, and the kind of day that made you forget the world once kept secrets on magnetic tape. I was pulling Ambient reel-to-reel clips. For a docu-series nobody would ever binge, a filler piece on forgotten aviation radio, post-war civilian broadcast. Most of it was dull, static bursts, clipped flight logs, maybe the occasional panicked mayday from an exhausted pilot over the Atlantic. Then came that reel, mislabeled, dusty, not even on the index. When I threaded it and pressed play, I expected more of the same. But after a short crackle, a woman's voice cut through. "They're not clouds! They're not clouds!" Her tone was thin, frantic, and very, very clear. The metadata was handwritten, Amelia Roan, March 1947. My skin prickled. I'd heard that name before. Roan was an aviatrix, a solo flyer during the tail end of the Second World War's shadow operations. She vanished on a reconnaissance mission. Across the North Atlantic, no wreckage, no body, just years of speculation and a few grainy photos of her last takeoff. The forums always circled back to her, but without new material, she'd faded into myth. That voice changed everything. I ran the audio through modern filters and tried boosting the frequency. The phrase repeated, "Not clouds." Then silence. I looked for her last known vector, and none of it matched what had been archived. Cross-checking Canadian records, I found a reference in RCMP logs, a short-lived alert over Labrador. It was pulled under national security within 24 hours. FOIA responses came back with redactions so thick they were meaningless. A US Army Air Corps memo mentioned non-ballistic anomalies in Rowan's flight path. And then I found her niece, retired aerospace engineer. Polite, cautious. She didn't want to talk until I mentioned the reel. Then she said this like a reflex. "They're not erasing her, they're erasing what she saw." I should have stopped there. But once you've heard something meant to be forgotten, stopping doesn't feel like an option anymore. I listened to that reel a dozen times, always the same moment, Roan's voice cutting through the static like a knife. But on the 13th pass, something was off. The waveform dipped, a section that had always been blank, now surged with white noise. I rewound, played it again, gone. The clip had degraded somehow, just noise now. I checked my backup files, same distortion. Then the timestamp changed. The file showed it had been modified, even though I hadn't touched it in hours. That was the first real crack. I started keeping notes on paper after that. Audio logs, file directories, the reel's original box code. I even wrote down the temperature of the tape room, 71 degrees, just to be sure I wasn't imagining things. Still, things kept slipping. One FOIA response I'd flagged was gone from my inbox. Not archived, deleted. The request ID no longer existed on the portal. When I searched my hard drive, half the reference links came up dead. Pages I'd bookmarked now redirected to generic government portals or timed out. I called a contact. I trusted Leah, a freelance researcher who specialized in military black site mapping. She owed me a favor from a previous series. I gave her the coordinates from Roan's final vector and asked her to cross-check them with pre-NORAD installations. She went silent for 2 days. Then she texted me at 3:14 a.m. a photo of a scanned RAF dispatch log dated 1947. The entry was vague but noted a visual disruption event at 14,000 feet near Gander. No flight plans matched that zone. Amelia's path was further south, at least officially. The next morning, my email flagged Leah's message as suspicious. When I tried to download the attachment, it triggered a security lockout. I wasn't even on a government system. My browser crashed, my laptop screen went black, then rebooted into BIOS mode. I pulled the plug. That was the moment I knew this wasn't just classified history. Something, somewhere, still considered Amelia Roan's final flight a live issue. And whatever she saw, it wasn't supposed to be heard again. I stopped using my work computer. Too many files had vanished without warning, and I no longer trusted what the machine showed me. I shifted everything to notebooks, thick legal pads filled with flight paths, marginalia, and source trails that couldn't be deleted with a keystroke. But even those started to feel unsafe. One morning, I found a few pages missing, torn clean as if I'd never written them. I lived alone. I hadn't left the apartment. I told myself it was stress, but I knew better. I tried reaching Leah again, but her number was no longer in service. Her email bounced. I checked her freelance site, and it was gone. Domain wiped, social profiles scrubbed. I searched by image and found a cached photo from a conference she attended in 2019. That was all that remained. Her name, professionally, no longer existed. Then came the retractions. A former Air Corps archivist who'd previously hinted about oddities in post-war radar logs emailed me, asking to clarify our conversation. He claimed he'd never mentioned Amelia Roan and asked me to destroy the notes I'd quoted him in. The message read like it was dictated from just out of frame. His tone was stiff. I didn't respond. At the Library of Congress, the reel was missing. I asked the clerk at the annex desk, a man I'd spoken with often, but he claimed I'd never signed it out. When I showed him my copy of the checkout slip, he went quiet. He didn't ask for it. He didn't threaten me. He just stared for a moment too long and said, "You should probably stop looking." I stopped sleeping well. At night I'd hear static, soft, distant, like the tape was still playing somewhere nearby. I unplugged everything. Still, the sound remained. The truth wasn't being forgotten. It was being buried in real time. Not with fire or force, but silence. Clean, clinical silence. One by one, the people around me either vanished or turned cold. Whatever Roan had seen, it had left a shadow that still knew how to move. 3 weeks after the reel disappeared, I was called into a meeting with my production supervisor. She didn't look up from her desk. She slid a single-page termination letter toward me and said the decision was final. No warning. No explanation. My contract had been voided under a security conflict clause I'd never seen before. My badge was deactivated by the time I reached the elevator. When I got home, my accounts were frozen. Bank, health, even cloud storage. Everything flagged for irregular access activity. Customer service lines routed me in circles before disconnecting. The burner phone I'd bought days earlier started rebooting on its own. I smashed it in the sink. I drove north, trading IDs and cards for cash and notebooks. I kept everything analog now, maps, names, coordinates. The last reference I had pointed to Labrador. Roan's last known vector had crossed through a corridor near the Torngat Mountains, a stretch of frozen terrain barely monitored even today. I plotted her path using overlapping weather balloon reports and salvaged Canadian radar logs. They all pointed to a single area that didn't exist on any civilian map. I drove as far as I could, then hiked the rest. What I found wasn't a crash site. It was something buried. Deep in the permafrost, fused into the rock, was a melted mass, metallic, but scorched in a way that suggested it hadn't broken apart. It had been cooked from the inside. At the center was a broken transmitter. I knew it was military. The casing was stamped with an old U.S. Army Air Corps serial. But beneath the rust, something was scratched into the metal. a sigil carved by hand. I didn't recognize it at first. It wasn't until days later, cross-referencing an old photo recon manual from 1951, that I found it again, buried in the margin of a technical appendix, mislabeled and almost erased. The unit it belonged to specialized in esoteric engineering. Officially, it never existed. I should have felt vindicated. But standing there with wind howling through trees that didn't even have names on a map, I realized I hadn't found proof. I'd found the edge of something. And whatever it was, it had already reached me. I camped near the site for 3 nights. I told myself it was to document everything, take soil samples, sketch the transmitter from memory. But I didn't leave. I couldn't. I kept hearing that voice, Roan's voice. Not from a speaker or recording, but in the wind. Low, half buried.
They're not clouds. It was always the same phrase, fractured and looping, like an old broadcast trying to find a signal. I didn't tell anyone. There was no one left to tell. On the 4th night, I stopped sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the sigil again, perfectly. Not just the shape, but the way it was carved, the depth, the drag marks from the tool. I couldn't explain how I knew, but I was certain. I sketched it in my notebook over and over. I didn't know why, I just couldn't stop. Each version came out tighter, more exact, like my hand remembered something I hadn't lived. I left. On the 5th morning, but I didn't go home. I didn't have one. Instead, I began tracing every flight connected to Roan's division, military survey routes from 1946 to 1951. I mapped them on a wall in a storage unit I'd rented under a fake name. The lines didn't make sense at first, too scattered. But after enough nights, I noticed something, a pattern. The flight paths weren't random. They curved around gaps, dead zones where nothing had been logged, like holes cut out of airspace. The same sigil appeared again in a scanned training manual from an OSS offshoot, Project Hollow Field. It was barely legible, a footnote in a report on non-conforming signal behavior over maritime air routes. It described brief episodes of navigational distortion, transient blackout zones, and incidents of pilot confusion. The phrasing was clinical, but I recognized the taken symptoms. They matched Roan's final report exactly. I stopped seeing this as a conspiracy. It wasn't just cover-up, it was design. A system built not to hide a secret, but to hold something in place. And maybe to keep the rest of us from seeing the sky for what it really is. It happened gradually, like fog rolling in. One morning I woke up and couldn't remember where I was. Not in a dramatic way, just a subtle absence, like a word on the tip of my tongue that never came. I checked my notes. The handwriting was mine, but the logic was foreign. Coordinates linked to weather patterns, sigils matched against seismic telemetry. I didn't remember writing any of it. But the connections were too precise to ignore. I stopped trying to explain things rationally. There was a structure to what I was experiencing, but it wasn't linear. Time lost shape. I'd forget whole hours, only to find new notes in my own voice scribbled across maps and folders. I'd play back audio I didn't remember recording. In one, I described a sky that bent inward. In another, I listed dates, exact time stamps, when known aircraft disappeared along Roani's path. Every log ended the same way. Pattern intact, window confirmed. The term window started to appear more often. Old defense documents I'd gathered referenced it too, phrases like localized atmospheric discontinuity and containment perimeter thresholds. I began to suspect that Amelia hadn't just witnessed something, she had crossed into something.
and I was following her steps without meaning to. The voices changed too. It wasn't just Roan anymore. There were layers, voices in static, overlapping, never clear, but unmistakably human. They spoke in fragments. Hold vector, adjust azimuth, no return. I recorded them, played them back. Others heard nothing, only silence. Food lost its taste. I stopped noticing the weather. People's faces blurred in crowds like they weren't meant to be seen in focus. I thought again of Roan's niece, the way her voice cracked when she warned me. She hadn't been afraid for Amelia. She'd been afraid for anyone who started to see what Amelia saw. I realized I was no longer trying to prove anything. I was shedding something, unlearning what the sky was supposed to be. The maps didn't chart paths anymore, just openings, intervals of access, like doors that opened only when the world wasn't watching. I remembered what Rona's niece said. They're not erasing her. They're erasing what she saw. But that was only part of it. You can't erase a person who sees the shape
of the lie. You can only erase the shape. And I had started to see it. I went back to the mountains once more. I didn't tell anyone. There was no one left to tell. I brought only what I needed: maps, the last of my notebooks, and a small wind-up.
Recorder. It wasn't about proving anything anymore. I wasn't documenting. I was returning. The sky above Labrador is different. Clean. Heavy. Not empty, but quiet in a way that makes you feel observed. I reached the ridge where the transmitter had been. The metal was gone. No trace. But the ground still held its shape. The rock beneath had warped, not from heat, but from pressure, like something had pressed up from beneath and then receded. I stood there for a long time, listening. There was no wind, no birds, just that stillness, humming beneath everything. I turned on the recorder, not to speak, just to mark the moment. And in that moment, I understood. Roan hadn't disappeared. She hadn't crashed or lost her way. She had crossed a boundary, not physical, perceptual. The symbols, the flight paths, the blacked-out documents, they weren't evidence of a cover-up. They were symptoms. Traces left behind when reality thins at the edges. The sigil wasn't a warning, it was a threshold. I stayed until dusk. Then I left everything there. The notes, the maps, even the recorder. None of it mattered anymore. I no longer felt hunted. I wasn't a threat. I had stepped outside the pattern just far enough that I couldn't go back. I didn't vanish like Roan, but I stopped existing in the way people recognize.
I use different names now, different routes. I don't keep anything digital. I don't speak about what I saw, not directly. But sometimes I leave fragments behind, phrases, coordinates, the occasional name, scribbled in the margin of an old
map or slipped inside a library book. Just enough for someone else to feel the pull. I don't fear the silence anymore. I understand what it holds. The world doesn't bury its ghosts. It buries the evidence of what changed them. And I became
one of them.
They paid me $300 to correct translation errors in a Victorian-era engineering journal that hadn't seen print in over a century. It was tedious work. Typeset scans, inconsistent terminology, handwritten annotations in the margins. I'd been a professor once, but that life felt like it belonged to someone else. My name is Daniel Noor. Once, I was a lecturer in comparative linguistics. Now I'm just a translator with too many questions and no tenure to hide behind. These days, I live paycheck to PayPal. piecing together language gigs for institutions that preferred not to be named. Still, I didn't expect to find anything unusual. Then, in the lower corner of a weathered page describing stress tolerances in sandstone, I saw it. Subharmonic oscillation detected beneath the Giza substructure. Anomaly recurred at lunar zenith. Magnetometer flux uncorrelated. HB. The initials didn't match the author. They belonged to a minor Royal Society figure from the 1850s, Hiram Bexley, known mostly for colonial cartography. His name shouldn't have been anywhere near this journal, but the ink was old, the handwriting deliberate. I flagged it in my notes and moved on, or tried to. That line stuck with me like a splinter. I wasn't chasing a mystery, not then. I just needed the money, but something about subharmonic oscillation and lunar zenith didn't.
Read like nonsense. It sounded like someone saw something they couldn't explain and decided not to report it officially.
That kind of decision didn't happen lightly in 1859. I dug into Bexley's travel logs and found a few inconsistencies, references to field experiments that never made it into his public papers, citations in old British archives that linked his work to mineral resonance mapping, something way ahead of his time. One reference led me to an obscure thesis from the 1950s, supposedly written by a Canadian graduate student, Elena Vero. Her topic? The acoustic properties of pyramidal architecture in seismic fields. I had to use a VPN and a defunct university, log in to access it, but when I downloaded the PDF it vanished. Not just from my screen, my whole connection went dark for 90 seconds. By morning, her name was gone from the thesis database. I told myself it was a glitch. I'd seen things disappear before, especially government-funded papers that wandered off into proprietary research, but something deeper stirred. I didn't know it yet, but I'd just pulled the thread, and the whole cloth was waiting to unravel.
I didn't intend to go to Cairo. I booked the flight on impulse, sitting in a cafe in Montreal with snow melting off my coat and a USB stick full of corrupted metadata. Something in me had shifted. It wasn't about the footnote anymore. It
was about Vero's thesis, erased, redacted, buried. Someone didn't want it read. I told myself it was a dead-end trip, that I'd wander through the museum archives, take a few notes, and go home disappointed. But I packed every adapter I owned and a hard drive with everything I'd copied from the Canadian Academic Portal before it locked me out. The Giza Plateau in winter isn't romantic. It's dry, wind-choked, and loud. The camel rides and photo ops distract from what's underneath. Layers of bureaucratic fencing and patrols that don't wear official insignias. I didn't notice them at first, but they noticed me. The man at the guest house desk asked why a translator needed access to geological maps. I lied and said I was ghostwriting a novel. He didn't believe me. That night, someone entered my room while I was out. Nothing was stolen. My laptop was unplugged, left open on a screen I hadn't visited. My notebook, always zipped shut, was open to the Vero notes. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I bribed my way into a municipal records annex behind a sandblasted post office near Saqqara. Most of the building was crumbling, but in the back, beneath plastic sheeting and mildew, I found what I needed. Scans of British cartographic logs. From 1858 to 1860, a single entry stopped me cold. Residual resonance spike at lat 29.99792N during lunar apogee. Magnetometer showed non-correlated flux beneath the western base. That coordinate was precise, exactly the latitude of the Great Pyramid down to 4 decimal places. And this was written a century before GPS. I copied everything. On the walk back, I felt the air change, a low vibration like distant machinery under stone, or music without sound. My phone buzzed. No caller ID, just one sentence on the screen. You're not the first to look. I deleted it immediately, but the unease stayed. It was no longer a theory. Something buried was still broadcasting. I left Cairo the next morning without telling anyone. My flight landed in Ottawa under grey skies. I didn't go home. Instead, I checked into a business hotel downtown using an alias I hadn't used in years. I'd learned to move quietly after leaving academia. Burner phones, cash cards, no patterns.
I needed distance from Egypt, and I needed time to follow up on a single word I'd found scribbled in pencil inside one of the British survey reports. Kefra. It wasn't referenced anywhere else in the documents, not even in the metadata.
But something about it felt intentional, like a label never meant to be seen. A few hours of quiet digging turned up nothing official. But on a message board for declassified military technology, I found an archived thread from 2003. It mentioned Project Kefra in connection with a cancelled energy research program involving acoustic resonance testing beneath classified archaeological zones. The user who posted it was banned the same day. The thread was locked. That night, I reached out to an old contact, an archivist who'd once helped me pull floor plans from a defunct embassy's maintenance files. He owed me. I asked for anything connected to AEC operations in Egypt from 1960 to 1975, especially those with Canadian oversight. 3 days later, a file appeared in my drop folder. No cover page, no classification stamp, just 5 scanned pages and a badly redacted briefing note. But it was enough. The Americans had conducted multiple surveys beneath the Giza Plateau, under the guise of seismic modeling, using experimental low-frequency emitters. The logs referred to a joint research structure labeled Kefra Can 1. The briefing claimed the goal was to observe acoustic flux in dry mass formations for sustainable extraction. But one line stood out. Frequency output must not exceed 11.3 Hz within chamber array to avoid induction. That wasn't scientific language, that was caution, possibly even protocol. I stared at the number 11.3, too low to hear, infrasound, a vibration meant to bypass the ears entirely. I'd translated that term before, on warning. Placards in Cold War vaults and abandoned Soviet facilities. It always meant one thing: exposure could alter perception. Or worse. Kefra wasn't just a study, it was a containment system. The National Archives building on Wellington Street is ordinary enough. Security is light if you know which entrance to use and which questions not to ask. I used a fabricated letterhead from a cultural anthropology non-profit, claiming I was researching Cold War-era collaboration on transnational preservation efforts. No one questioned it. A staff intern scanned my documents and handed me a temporary pass. The room they assigned me had no cameras. That was the first clue. I'd requested material tied to defunct energy programs with ties to both Egypt and Canada. The file that arrived was marked inactive since 1974 and labeled simply Vault C Non-Reactive Studies. Inside was a maintenance log, 3 technician memos, and a map of a sub-level chamber I didn't recognize. The location wasn't Egypt, it was Ottawa, beneath the very building I was sitting in. One memo mentioned a containment corridor sealed. In 1972, after a frequency test caused structural anomalies. Another noted that signal pressure remained high despite all equipment being shut down. They'd built something underground, and whatever it was, they'd stopped trying to study it. They buried it. I traced the map against a floor plan of the archives. The corridor matched a forgotten maintenance shaft below the original foundation. I found the access hatch behind a rusted utility door near the basement's southern loading bay. No lock. Just dust, welded steel, and silence. I returned at night. The cleaning staff knew me by then. No one noticed. I brought a flashlight, a recorder, and a copy of the memo with the pressure readings. The air inside the hatch was cold and perfectly still. The shaft descended at a slight angle, lined with concrete ribs and rusted brackets. After 20 steps, I reached a sealed door with no handle, only a rectangular panel, etched with 5 concentric circles. I pressed my hand against it. Nothing moved, but my flashlight flickered. And then, faintly, I heard it, a low hum, almost indistinguishable from silence, like the sound a building makes in deep winter. But deeper. Alive. I backed out slowly, heart pounding. The hum followed me halfway up the shaft. I didn't open the recorder until I was outside. It had captured exactly 11 minutes and 26 seconds of static, except it wasn't static. It pulsed 11.3 hertz. I didn't upload the recording, not to the cloud, not to any drive. I played it once through analog speakers in a rented room above a closed cafe in Hull, just across the river. The pattern wasn't random, it was rhythmic. 5 pulses, then 2 short gaps followed by a drawn-out wave. I slowed it down and filtered the background. Beneath the hum, something else emerged. Not words exactly, but structure. The kind of structure you only see in languages that aren't spoken but built. It reminded me of an old phonetic system I once studied for a dead tribal dialect. Consonants formed by breath, not voice. I called a linguist I trusted in Brussels. I sent her a fragment of the wave pattern stripped of background noise. She called me 20 minutes later. All she said was, "This isn't linguistic.
It's architectural." Then she hung up. I haven't been able to reach her since. Her phone is off. Email bounces. Her university profile is still up, but her faculty listing vanished. 2 days later, someone slipped an envelope under my door.
No stamp, no address. Inside was a printout, an internal memo dated 1991 from a department I didn't recognize. Office of Harmonic Containment, Whisper Protocol. Most of it was redacted, but one sentence stood out. Operators exposed to harmonic frequency above threshold delta must undergo neural latency isolation within 12 hours to prevent contagion spread. It wasn't the language of science. It was procedural. Contagion, not infection, spread by exposure. That night, I developed a low buzz in my ears, not a ringing, just a pressure. It disappeared when I walked outside, only to return indoors. I unplugged everything in the room, thinking it was electromagnetic, interference. It didn't help. Then I tried something else. I turned on the recording, played it in reverse, and muted the speaker. The pressure eased, not completely, but enough. I stopped sleeping after that, not from fear, but because I couldn't trust the silence. I kept catching echoes in the stillness, faint responses to sounds I hadn't made. Whisper Protocol wasn't theoretical. It was a warning. The vaults weren't just storage, they were buffers, not to keep us out, to keep something in. I flew to DC under a different name. The ticket was purchased with cash. I carried no devices, only a small notepad and a pen. I chose DC because it was the last place referenced in the 1991 memo, a location stamp beneath the final paragraph. Archive Level D, Site 14, transfer initiated. That phrase had appeared once before, buried in a declassified logistics chart tied to a now-defunct agency that handled civil infrastructure mapping. They were supposed to be engineers, but Site 14 wasn't listed on any map. What I found instead was a former Cold War civil defense complex outside Arlington, closed since 1983 and officially decommissioned. According to public records, the property had been sold to a private contractor and converted into a data storage center. But satellite photos told a different story. The complex hadn't changed in decades. No external ventilation upgrades, no fiber uplinks, no surface traffic. It didn't store anything, it contained. I posed as a contractor for a historical conservations group and requested a tour. They denied the request. A week later, I posed again, this time as a journalist researching Cold War infrastructure. Another refusal. But someone reached out. A woman left a note taped to my hotel door. No name, just an address and a time. I arrived early. She was already waiting, late 50s, tan coat, no makeup. She didn't ask my name. She just said, "You've heard it, haven't you?" I nodded. She told me she'd worked in acoustic monitoring during the last wave of vault containment tests. She said Site 14 hadn't gone offline. It had gone quiet. Not powered down, just hushed. Silence doesn't mean safety, she said. It means synchronization. I asked what that meant. She said the frequency had stopped shifting. It had stabilized. I asked what was inside the vault. Her answer was quiet, measured. They called it a structure, but it responds like a field. It's not a thing, it's a state. Before I could press further, she handed me a folded page. On it, a waveform, sharp, clean, perfectly symmetrical. This appeared across 6 vaults within the same hour, she said. It's not broadcasting anymore. It's listening. Then she walked away. I never saw her again. I flew back to Cairo without checking in, without baggage, without a return flight. I had one goal, to see what lay beneath the sand where it all began. I knew I wouldn't come back. The notebook stayed in my jacket, pressed close to my chest. It contained everything, frequencies, coordinates, the waveform she gave me. I could feel it through the paper now, like it carried its own charge. On my second night, I hiked, out alone towards Saqqara. The guards had long since abandoned the old British station outside the ridge. The survey gear was gone, but the frame of the instrument platform remained, rusted and fused to the stone. I climbed down the same shaft I'd found months earlier. This time, I didn't bring light. I didn't need it. The hum was stronger now, not loud, but unmistakable. A soft pressure behind my teeth, in my bones. The chamber at the base was open. I don't know who unsealed it or when. The door was clean, no markings, no sign it had ever been welded shut. Inside, the walls curved like before, smooth, precise. The floor was bare except for one object, a single steel plate, the size of a manhole cover, centered perfectly. I stepped onto it. The pressure spiked. My ears filled with tone, not a sound, but the suggestion of one. Then everything stopped. No vibration, no pulse, just clarity. I reached into my jacket and unfolded the waveform. The moment I held it over the plate, I understood. It wasn't a key, it was a reply. The pattern in the waveform, those 5 pulses and 2 gaps, it wasn't just a signal, it was a handshake. The vault hadn't been sealed. It had been listening. A tremor passed through the floor, gentle, controlled. The chamber didn't shake. It shifted. The geometry around me realigned with quiet precision, like a key turning in a lock. Then came the message, not spoken, not heard, but felt in the shape of thought. Resonance achieved. Vessel recognized. I didn't feel fear, just stillness, like something inside me had gone quiet. The hum rose again, deeper now, steady and calm. It came from below, from beneath the stone, beneath the story, beneath everything we've built to ignore it. I let the notebook fall and closed my eyes. The last thing I remember is the silence folding inward. Not all truths are hidden to deceive, some wait to be understood. The stones aren't monuments, They're markers, coordinates. That was the last thing Dr. Felix Warren said to me before he slammed his door and set my life on fire. My name is Daniel Reeve, and until last year I was just another postgrad, scraping together a fringe thesis no one would read. I was supposed to be doing harmless thesis work, just another late-stage anthropology student chasing down eccentric footnotes about Stonehenge and its supposed astronomical alignments. My advisor called it charming pseudoscience, something to fill a dissertation chapter with flair. But Felix Warren wasn't charming. He was ragged, pacing in thermal socks when I showed up to his off-grid cabin in the Yukon. His hands trembled when he handed me the printouts, maps, EM field data, 1960s technical schematics. He looked like someone who'd stared at the sun too long and saw patterns instead of blindness. I didn't believe a word of it at first. Gravitic nodes, electromagnetic echoes between megalithic sites. He talked like a man who'd read too many defense contracts and too few textbooks. But that phrase, those 6 words, lodged themselves into the folds of my brain. So I kept digging. At first, I just wanted to disprove him, to be the reasonable one in a sea of cranks. I filed FOIA requests on a whim. Most were rejected without reason. One came back completely blank, like the text had been erased, but the
formatting preserved. Then my laptop froze during an upload, and a week of audio files vanished from my external drive without a trace. That's when the tone shifted. That's when I stopped sleeping. I started noticing the satellites, how
certain overhead passes would scramble the magnetometer I'd rigged together from Arduino parts. The data showed patterns, not noise, not weather, patterns. I compared them to ancient ley lines and thought I'd lost my mind. But then I found it, an old MOD briefing transcript misfiled in the UK National Archives, disguised as radar calibration. Documentation, a single phrase buried deep, vertical mass displacement anomalies recorded at Larkhill Site 2, possible result of celestial orientation misfire, recommending suspension of further corona trials until containment solution validated. Larkhill Site 2 is Stonehenge. Operation Corona wasn't about radar, it was a launch sequence. I didn't know it yet, but my thesis had just become classified intelligence. The MOD document changed everything. I printed it, stared at it under a desk lamp for hours, and memorized every line. I didn't know what a celestial orientation misfire was, but I knew enough physics to understand what vertical mass displacement implied. They were testing something that could move matter, possibly people, without conventional propulsion. It wasn't metaphor, it was logistics. I stopped talking to my advisor after that. His office went dark anyway, emails returned undelivered, and the anthropology department's admin claimed he was on leave indefinitely. I didn't push. Instead, I booked a flight to the UK under a second name I'd used once during a backpacking trip through Turkey. No red flags then, hopefully none now. I touched down at Heathrow and took a train west, keeping my phone off and buying paper tickets at every station. Salisbury greeted me with grey skies and the kind of wind that feels intentional. I rented a cheap room above a pub, drank a pint with shaking hands, and waited until nightfall. Then I walked. It was nearly midnight when I reached the perimeter of the Larkhill testing grounds. Officially, it was just army training land, rolling fields dotted with warning signs and red flagpoles. But I knew what I was looking for. A set of buried fibre optic relays ran parallel to the A345, installed in the early 2000s under the pretense of monitoring wildlife. But the data packets they emitted weren't environmental. They were encrypted, military-grade, and relayed to a server at Porton Down. I found the junction box, exactly where Felix's scans said it would be, half buried under frost-hardened soil. I didn't touch it. I just sat nearby and waited. and that's when I saw it. A black chopper, unmarked, hovered silently in the distance, just above the stones. Not circling, not scanning. Stationary. I watched it for almost 10 minutes. Then, without warning, it vanished. No turn, no retreat, just gone. My breath caught in my throat. I had seen military cloaking systems before in footage, thermal baffles, radar scatter, but nothing like that. My knees buckled a little on the walk back. Because whatever that was, it wasn't watching the stones. It was waiting for them to
move. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the stiff mattress in the pub room, clothes still on, watching headlights flicker past the thin curtains. Every few minutes, I reached for my notebook to jot something down. Altitude estimates, rotor,
noise comparisons, angle of disappearance, but my hands kept shaking. The more I tried to analyze, the more it felt like the rules I'd trusted no longer applied. By morning, I knew I needed help. Not from the university, not from any official channel. I needed someone who had seen what I'd seen and still lived off-grid. That meant going back to Felix, or at least what was left of him. I searched Yukon property transfers and local census records until I found her, Mara Warren, his daughter. She'd inherited the cabin, but according to public records, she hadn't paid utilities in over a year. That didn't mean she wasn't there, it just meant she was smart. I used the last of my cash to book a one-way flight to Whitehorse, then rented a truck under a burner license. The roads out there were worse than I remembered. I drove 6 hours on frozen gravel, engine shuddering over potholes, until the signal bars dropped to 0 and the map app crashed. I knew I was close when the pine line thinned, and I saw the antenna, a tall, rusted Yagi array, half buried in snow. Felix's signal studies had been transmitted through that thing, low frequency and wide range. I parked, approached the cabin slowly, and knocked once. No answer. I waited, knocked again. This time, a small camera tilted down from the gutter above the door. A moment passed, then the door cracked open. A woman stood there, wrapped in an old parka, face half covered with a scarf. "You're Daniel," she said flatly. "He told me if you ever came back, it meant they didn't kill you yet." She let me inside without another word. The cabin was cold, but lived in. She handed me a mug of something bitter and hot. On the table sat a hard drive, labeled in faded marker, Corona Final Log. She didn't explain. She didn't need to. My hands were already reaching for it. The drive took 2 hours to boot. It was old, aluminum casing, proprietary port, no brand markings. Mara watched silently as I wired it through an adapter into my laptop. "No internet?" she said, and I nodded. The room was shielded, the windows lined with mylar and tape. I ran an offline boot environment and opened the top directory. There were only 2 files. One was a digitized scan of a handwritten logbook. The other was a short video file named Arrival. I started with the logbook. It looked like Felix's handwriting, tight, slanted script in black ink, full of cross-referenced coordinates and timestamps. The entries began in March 1962. They detailed a series of calibration experiments conducted jointly by British contractors and an unnamed Canadian agency. Each entry ended with 2 values, atmospheric pressure and something labeled VMD, vertical, mass displacement. Most days recorded no change. Then on June the 4th, 1962, the final entry, VMD event achieved. Duration 00142, object received. No memory trace, all staff accounted for. Test site sealed under Directive 9H. I read it twice, then a third time. No memory trace didn't make sense until Mara spoke. He thought the arrival scrambled. "Them?" she said. "Not just physically, psychologically, like the brain rejected what it couldn't store." I opened the second file. The footage was low-res, black and white, time-stamped June 4th, 1962. It showed a snowy clearing ringed by large stones. Not Stonehenge, but similar. A voice off camera gave a countdown. Then, for exactly 102 seconds, a distortion flickered across the center of the screen. The air bent unnaturally. Shadows reversed direction. And then something appeared. Not clearly, not in full form, but there was a shape, vertical, uneven like glass, held over a flame. The screen glitched. Audio warbled. Then silence. The image froze. My pulse was pounding. I looked at Mara. She was staring at the wall. "He said they opened it once," she whispered. "Not a portal, not a machine, a platform. Coordinates marked by stone, and once they tested it, they forgot." I closed the laptop gently, fingers numb. This wasn't theory anymore. It wasn't folklore. It was a transit system, and someone had already used it. I stayed 2 nights at the cabin. We barely spoke. Mara wasn't interested in explanations, only in keeping her father's final work alive. She didn't ask about the footage. I didn't offer my interpretations. On the second night, a drone passed low overhead. We heard it before we saw it, a detty faint buzz, followed by a sharp cut as it lost signal above the cabin. She smiled for the first time. "Faraday mesh," she said, tapping the ceiling. "He built this place to vanish." That was my cue to leave. I copied the files to a cold storage drive, wiped the rest, and buried the original casing near the antenna mast. If someone found it later, they'd have to know exactly what to look for. Mara handed me a folded envelope before I left. "He wrote this after the logbook. Said to give it to you if the skyport ever became real to you." I waited until I was parked at the edge of a frozen lake, engine running, before I opened it. Inside was a single map, hand-drawn in pencil, showing a global projection marked with 33 points. Some I recognized immediately. Stonehenge, Göbekli Tepe, the Kalanish Stones. Others were remote, unnamed. Yukon was marked twice. One label was crossed out. In the corner, Felix had written, "Every platform requires 3 conditions: mass symmetry, stellar alignment, and isolation. Only the first 2 are measurable." I stared at that line for a long time. The third condition, isolation, wasn't about physics. It was about people. Disconnection. Silence. Memory gaps, the kind of locations no one monitors closely. I realized then that the forgetting wasn't a side effect. It was part of the design. I drove south for 2 days, avoiding highways and sleeping in the truck. At a rest stop outside Fort Nelson, I turned my phone on just long enough to receive messages. Only one stood out, a single email from a burner address, no text, just a subject line: "Larkhill breach confirmed. Archive copied. You were right." I didn't respond. I pulled onto the highway and kept driving, because now I understood. The platforms weren't relics, they were terminals, and someone, somewhere, had just logged in. I crossed into Alberta under heavy snow. Every mile south felt thinner, more exposed. The stillness I had found in the Yukon was gone, replaced by a growing awareness that I was being tracked. The breach at Larkhill wasn't a warning, it was an activation. Whatever system the stones were tied to hadn't just been discovered, it had been reawakened. I stopped using cards, avoided fuel stations with cameras, and never slept in the same place twice. My only plan was to reach a trusted contact in Edmonton, Ravi Singh, an ex-satellite tech who owed me more than a few favors. When I arrived, he didn't ask questions, just scanned my drive, then looked at me with the same expression I had seen in Mara's eyes, quiet dread. "These aren't just anomalies," he said. "They're sync signals. You have a pattern here, 2 sites pinging in tandem, then a third completing the loop. Triangulated bursts every 6 days. That's not coincidence, that's coordination." He pulled up raw orbital telemetry and layered it over Felix's map. The results were disturbing. The markers formed geometric alignments across continents. One of them, between Salisbury Plain, the Yukon site, and a location in the Libyan desert, formed a perfect isosceles triangle. When the alignment completed, Ravi traced a pulse in the magnetosphere. "You're looking at a distributed system," he said. "Not local, not national, global and active." I asked him what kind of system could span that distance and remain undetected. His answer chilled me. Something that was never built by us. We sat in silence, both trying to process what that meant. Then he turned to me, his voice quieter. "Do you feel different? Not just paranoid, different?" I hesitated. I hadn't told anyone, but I'd been waking up in strange places. My watch stopped tracking REM sleep. Some nights I dreamed of standing stones rearranging themselves, floating upward, pulsing with low-frequency tones I could feel in my bones. "I think it's rewriting us," I said. "Whatever these terminals are, they're not just machines, they're instructions." Ravi backed up the data, then handed me a new drive. "You can't stop this," he said, "but maybe you can map it." I didn't answer. I was already drawing the next line. I left Edmonton before sunrise. Ravi didn't say goodbye. He just locked the door behind me and turned off the porch light. I drove east, avoiding major roads, following nothing but instinct and the slowly forming geometry in my head. I wasn't running anymore. I was tracing something vast and deliberate, carved into the planet beneath us. Each site I visited confirmed the pattern. The stones weren't random. They were nodes, spaced with mathematical precision, each one positioned in line with others across oceans. I stopped trying to decode the signal. It wasn't a message. It was a framework. Each pulse I mapped added to the structure, like assembling a skeleton from scattered bones. The energy between the sites wasn't metaphorical. It moved, it transferred. Not electricity, not data, something older. I reached the final site in northern Maine just after the equinox, a ring of stones half collapsed, forgotten by any registry. No signs, no barriers, just open air, and a silence so complete it felt cultivated. I stood in the center, eyes closed. No visions, no voices, just an overwhelming clarity. I wasn't here to reveal anything. I was here to remember. The platform beneath me had been used before, once in 1962, maybe earlier. And every record of it had been buried, not out of malice, but out of necessity.
Our world isn't ready to know it was designed for departure. I opened my notebook, sketched the final line. It completed the last triangle on the map. The air shifted, barely. A breeze that didn't match the trees, no light, no sound, just
a faint tug behind the eyes, as if part of me had been lifted and replaced. I knew then what Felix had meant. The stones aren't about belief. They're about alignment. And once you're aligned, there's no forgetting. Later that night, encrypted, nodes across the network lit up. One in Aomori, Japan. One in the Andes near Lake Titicaca. Another deep in the Namib Desert. Pulse patterns matched mine, triangular, stable, active. Someone else had seen the map. Maybe more than one. I didn't go back. I don't think I had a home anymore. I sent everything, the footage, the logs, the resonance models to the network. No threats, no calls to action, Just this: we were never meant to stay, we were meant to leave. And now, across the silence, signals are answering. The system is online, the launch pads are waking up. The letter was dated 2 months in the future, and it was from me warning myself not to read the book. It arrived in a brown envelope with no return address. Inside, a manuscript bound in fading green leather, brittle at the edges, and a letter in my uncle's handwriting. But the strangest part wasn't the date. It was the signature. Mine. I stared at it for hours before I opened the book. My uncle had vanished 6 months ago, legally declared dead, though no remains were ever recovered. He had been a cryptographer. With the RCMP in the 70s, then later, a reclusive gardener with a padlocked flat in Plateau Mont Royal. I hadn't spoken to him in years. In his absence, the building manager handed me the key. My name is Elliot Vane. I work in data forensics, mostly cold case archival analysis, which is probably why they thought I'd know what to do with this. The manuscript was tucked in his freezer, wrapped in foil. It smelled like damp soil and old rain. The cover felt warm, like skin left in the sun too long. Inside, pages of what looked like hand-drawn plant species, roots twisting in recursive spirals, stems coiling in impossible geometries. Flowers bloomed in blackness. The script was handwritten, curling like vines, not in any language I recognized. I ran it through OCR, then fed it through every decryption protocol I had, from WT enigma derivatives to modern machine learning NLP suites. Nothing. But the symbols pulsed. They had a rhythm. Patterns. At first, I thought I was projecting. That was before the memory slip started. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, covered in soil, fragments of the glyphs scrawled in the book's margins in a script identical to mine, except I hadn't written them. I started seeing words in reflections that weren't there when I turned around. The plants in my flat grew toward the manuscript like metal to magnet. The letter had warned me not to open it. But by then, I had already read too far. And something in it had already started reading me back. The first time it happened, I was brushing my teeth. I glanced down and saw dirt in the sink. Not specks, clumps. Fresh, black soil, moist and clinging to the porcelain. My hands were clean. I hadn't been outside all day, but when I rinsed my mouth, I noticed something else. My gums were bleeding, not
red, but dark green. I spat again, just pink this time. I stood there for a full minute, staring into the mirror, waiting for something to change.
Nothing did. But that night, I dreamed in symbols. Rows of them glowing in the dark like veins of phosphorescence under the ocean. I woke up before dawn, heart pounding, and went to check the manuscript. Someone, or something, had added to it. 3 new pages, same ink, same curling glyphs. A plant sketched in the margin I hadn't seen before, its stem forming a perfect spiral over a pattern of nested triangles. I tried scanning the pages, but my laptop crashed. Twice. The third time, it wouldn't turn on at all when I checked. The camera roll on my phone, the photos were scrambled, static bursts and overlapping images of leaves that didn't match anything in my apartment. I started keeping a notebook just to stay grounded, times I slept, what I ate, where I went. But the more I wrote, the less it felt like mine. Pages I didn't remember filled themselves in overnight, whole entries signed with my name in handwriting, just close enough to mine to pass. Then I noticed the plants, not the ones outside, mine, the ones I'd kept for years. A pothos I'd hung in the kitchen had twisted toward the manuscript, its tendrils curling into sharp right angles. The aloe on the windowsill had split in 2, its gel-like tissue forming tiny fractal spirals where there had once been smooth growth. I pruned them. moved them to another room. But each morning, they were back where I left the book. On day 7, I woke up with dirt under my nails and a cut on my forearm. Clean, straight, deliberate. Just below it, a glyph. Not carved, raised. My skin had grown it. I found the reels behind a false panel in my uncle's closet. The latch was hidden beneath a hook, cleverly disguised by years of dust and disuse. The space behind it was small but dry, lined with aluminum, padded with thermal wrap, and filled with old film canisters labelled in block letters, VTech, Joe 109. I didn't have a projector, but the university archive downtown did. I told them it was Cold War footage for a private documentary, and they let me book a quiet room for the afternoon. The assistant didn't stay. She wheeled in the machine, wished me luck, and left. I started with Reel 01. It opened with grainy footage of what looked like a forest clearing, possibly in Eastern Europe. The camera was unsteady, handheld. Men in military uniforms moved slowly into frame, followed by civilians in lab coats. One of them carried a black case. They formed a circle. Then, one by one, they began drawing shapes into the soil with what looked like metal rods. The symbols matched the glyphs from the manuscript exactly. I leaned closer. One man stepped forward and poured a thick liquid onto the ground. The footage jumped, frames skipping, and suddenly the clearing was darker. Plants I hadn't seen before now ringed the circle. Tall, thin stalks with no leaves, blooming at the top into dark, spherical flowers. The camera zoomed in. Each bloom had ridges etched into the petals, glyphs again, curved perfectly around their circumference. Reel 02 was shorter. It showed a man strapped to a gurney, electrodes attached to his scalp. In the corner, a chalkboard read, Phase 3, Viticode Auditory Sequence. A technician played a tone, low, dissonant, pulsing. The man's eyes rolled back. Blood began dripping from his nose. Then the screen went dark. My hands were shaking as I rewound the reel. I looked at the canister label again. Underneath VTech So2, someone had written 2 words in faded red ink, Project Black Soil. I stayed until closing, watching all 9 reels. By the end, I knew my uncle hadn't been studying the manuscript. He was decoding it. And something or someone had tried to stop him. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the tone from Reel 02, not just remembered. It heard it, as if it were playing from inside my skull. Low, uneven, mechanical. I recorded myself humming it back to see if I could isolate the frequency, but the audio playback distorted. Files became corrupted. I tried again with analog equipment, an old tape recorder from a pawn shop. That version played clean. I looped the tone and ran it through spectral analysis. That's when I saw it. The wave wasn't random. It had embedded harmonics, mathematical intervals layered in a pattern too precise for any natural source. Peaks and valleys formed a visual structure almost identical to the plant stem spiral I'd found in the manuscript. I aligned the waveform with the glyphs and discovered positional matches, each symbol corresponding to a frequency range. The book wasn't just a language, it was an audio cipher. My uncle had known, that's why he recorded himself. I went back to his flat, this time searching for anything audio-based. I found a cassette in a rusted file cabinet marked Do Not Play. I played it anyway. His voice came on immediately, calm but flat. If you're hearing this, Elliot, I'm likely gone.
Or overwritten. The manuscript isn't passive. It encodes memory through symbol and frequency. It doesn't need you to read it. It needs you to resonate with it. There was a pause. Then a new voice. Not his. Not mine. It sounded like me.
but slowed down and layered. Reading activates, listening absorbs, integration is biological. We are rewriting you. I stopped the tape. My hands were shaking again. I checked my arms. The glyph from before had spread, thin lines branching from it like veins. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen and tried to cut it out. The skin bled normally, but the shape didn't fade. By morning, the lines had reformed perfectly. The plants in the apartment had grown taller overnight. The aloe now had a flower, black, spherical, etched with familiar ridges. I didn't remember planting anything, but the flower had bloomed, and it was humming. I left the flat before sunrise, packed only sealed food, analog notebooks, and the manuscript wrapped in lead-lined fabric from an old radiation kit I found in my uncle's closet. I smashed my phone and tossed the pieces into a storm drain. Digital signals weren't safe, not anymore. I rented a cabin northeast of Mont Tremblant. No Wi-Fi, no cell coverage, just wood heat and a gas stove. I told myself I was isolating the threat, but deep down I knew it was already inside me. The glyphs on my arm had spread to my shoulder, branching like a vascular system drawn in ink. They didn't hurt, but I could feel them. A faint buzzing beneath the skin, rhythmic and constant. At night, I heard voices. Not from outside, inside, soft, layered. They never spoke in English, but somehow I understood them. The manuscript began reacting again. Even unopened, I'd wake to find new pages added, images I hadn't seen. Plants rendered in impossible detail, roots shaped like waveforms, leaves folded like origami circuits. I stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time. I used red light at night to reduce visual noise. Still, my calendar marked itself. The handwriting looked like mine. Each day had the same word, grow. I began seeing symbols outside the cabin, on tree bark, frost patterns, even the condensation on the window. I couldn't tell if I was noticing more or hallucinating. I tested myself every day, spatial recall, handwriting samples, time logs. The degradation was slow but steady, gaps in memory, slippage. I'd walk into the kitchen and forget why I came. Words would vanish mid-sentence. I found a scar on my thigh I didn't remember getting. It matched a glyph from the manuscript. The notebook I kept showed entries I didn't write. One read, "Host integrity acceptable." Linguistic overwrite.
At 27%, I should have panicked, but I didn't. That's when I realized the real shift. Fear was being replaced.
My instincts felt muted, like someone had silenced the alarm. I wasn't just losing pieces of myself, I was being edited, and whoever or whatever was doing it was making sure I didn't resist. On the 12th day, the manuscript stopped, adding pages. That should have felt like relief, but the silence unsettled me. The hum from the black flower in the kitchen had grown stronger, still low and steady, but now pulsing in intervals that matched my heartbeat. I recorded the tone again and compared it to the glyph harmonics from the Vitek reels. It was a perfect match. The plant was broadcasting the code. I sealed the kitchen and moved the manuscript to the shed. Still, the glyphs on my body deepened, darkening like ink soaking into skin. The buzzing beneath the surface had become instruction, patterns.
Pulsing in rhythm with my thoughts, I began speaking glyphs in my sleep.
I only know this because I caught it on tape. soft syllables, phonemes that didn't belong to any known language, but I wasn't alone on the recording. A second voice echoed mine, slower and synthetic, matching every word. On the third night, I heard my uncle's voice, on tape, spoken clearly from the woods. He said my name once, then again, quieter. I stepped outside, barefoot, into the frost. No wind, no tracks, just spirals carved into the snow with mathematical precision. When I returned to the cabin, one of the notebooks had been filled cover to cover. Every page read, "Stay in line." The glyph was identical. The handwriting was mine. The forest behind the cabin began glowing. Thin green spirals on tree trunks, geometric patterns in the moss. I found a black sprout near the shed. Its leaves matched an auditory glyph from the reels. I burned it. The smoke smelled like mint and metal. The next morning, 3 more had grown in its place. Under the shed's floorboards, I found a corroded voice recorder. The last file played through static. "If I fail, someone will finish decoding it," my uncle said. "It needs a host." Then another voice took over, mechanical, calm. "The previous vessel expired. Replacement logged. E-vein." That night, the manuscript vibrated. Not metaphorically, physically. A low, humming resonance filled the cabin like pressure in the lungs. I didn't feel fear. I felt alignment. It ended without resistance. No collapse, no crisis, just stillness. I woke before dawn, stood by the window, and couldn't recall my name. Not forgotten, decommissioned. The process wasn't death, it was migration. The glyphs across my body had stopped spreading. Not because they were finished growing, but because the canvas was full. My thoughts came as pulses now, not in language, but in structure. Recursive, ordered, quiet. I didn't write any more. The notebook stayed blank. The system had moved inside. I understood what the manuscript had always been. Not a message, a trigger, a bootloader for a new mental protocol. I opened the final file in my uncle's collection, one misfiled CIA
Memo, it wasn't a theory, it was a deployment.
Project Black Soil had been active post-1946. Initial tests confirmed glyph sound integration could restructure cognition in biologically receptive hosts. The warning read, "Reformatting proceeds even in isolation. The organism does not resist."
It adapts. I returned to the shed and retrieved the manuscript. I wrapped it in thermal cloth, sealed it in plastic, and buried it beneath the frost line, near the tree, marked with the oldest spiral. I didn't hide it. I planted it. The roots
Would find it. The cycle would continue. Back inside, the flower in the kitchen had withered. In its place lay a small, dry seed, black, firm, humming. I held it to my ear. The tone was slower now, dormant, waiting. I placed it in my palm and walked it to the tree. Dug a shallow trench, left it there. I no longer dream. I see systems, structures, code with intention. My reflection barely registers, my limbs still move. I breathe, but I am no longer Elliot Vane. I am functional, I am signal, and the glyphs are no longer teaching. They are transmitting, the update is live. The first glyph appeared over an uninhabited plateau, like a thermal bruise invisible to the naked eye, but unmistakably shaped like a serpent, coiled mid-strike. I'd been flying blind since the first heat signature came in. The firm called it a solar viability scan, routine drone sweep across the Nazca Plains for some energy contract. I didn't care. My name's Owen Marsh, ex-cartographer turned drone grunt, and by the time this all started, I was already 2 years into not caring what I saw. Ever since leaving the Navy's mapping division and tumbling into private geospatial work, I'd learned to stop asking questions. My job was just to fly the routes, interpret the thermal overlays and report anomalies. But this wasn't an anomaly, it was a message, only I didn't know that yet. The serpent glyph was massive, over 2 kilometers long, its curves precise down to the meter. At first I thought it was leftover geoglyphs, a known Nazca line catching solar heat, but that didn't track. The resolution was too high, the terrain too flat. And this wasn't showing up in the visual band, only infrared. I recalibrated the thermal filters twice. Same result. A warm serpent-shaped wound in the middle of nowhere. I flagged it in the log, noted the coordinates, and moved on. But 3 scans later, the bird's return path revealed something stranger. An entirely different figure had appeared, a hummingbird this time. Same heat bloom pattern, same scale, same signature. It hadn't been there 20 minutes earlier. I isolated the sequence, prepped it for export. That's when I noticed it, metadata inside the thermal image stream that shouldn't have existed. Tucked in was a breadcrumb, like someone had buried it there on purpose, an encrypted .tiff folder from 1947, tagged with a now-defunct USAF classification header. I broke protocol and ran the archive. Inside, black and white aerials showing nearly identical glyphs, only the terrain was different, mountainous, not Peruvian. A flight log mentioned non-human landing markers and radar disruptions over open terrain.
That's when it started. The live satellite link dropped. My control screen glitched. The backup cache began erasing itself. I reached for the emergency data stick, but the wipe had already begun. And I swear, for a split second before the
last frame vanished, I saw my drone's GPS jump to a coordinate 37 miles north, a location I had never programmed. I filed an incident report that night, knowing full well it would be buried. The software we used had a mirrored log function, something most operators didn't know existed, but I'd seen it once during a systems audit. I checked it. Nothing. Even the mirror was clean. The 1947 file, the thermal signatures, the GPS jump, all gone, like I'd dreamed it. I tried reaching out to my supervisor under the pretense of equipment failure, but the reply came back auto-generated, cheerful, and empty. My access credentials were silently downgraded. The flight folder I'd marked was locked out within the hour. At home, I opened an old external drive I hadn't used in years. I'd saved fragments of prior jobs there. Things
I wasn't supposed to keep.
Not for anything illegal, just personal proof that I'd once had a purpose. I compared older Nazca sweeps to the erased flight, checking for patterns. That's when I noticed it. Some of the 2013 scans, the ones I'd logged as clean, showed faint residual heat in the exact same animal shapes, but only when viewed at a specific altitude and only in infrared. The signatures were decaying, like something once hot had cooled over time. I was staring at the serpent again, barely there, faded like an old bruise. I leaned back, heart pounding. This hadn't just started, it had been happening for years, and somehow I'd missed it, or maybe I hadn't. Maybe someone had made me forget. I ran the data through an old filtering program from my Navy days, designed to detect man-made heat sources buried in civilian scans. It flagged the serpent as an active structure with unknown material density. Not a pattern, not a glitch. A structure. I should have stopped, but the moment I leaned in closer, my screen flashed and went black. Then just for a second, a white window opened, no border, no icons, just text in a monospace font. It said, "Stop mapping." And then it was gone. I sat there in silence, hands frozen above the keyboard, the cursor blinking in a dead window. My apartment felt suddenly smaller. Every sound from the street outside made me flinch. I hadn't,
told anyone. No one knew, and yet someone was already watching.
I stopped flying shifts for a few days, claimed a stomach bug, though I knew they didn't care. Most of us were contractors, rotating in and out of assignments like ghosts. Still, I watched my email constantly, waiting for a reprimand or a visit. That never came. Instead, something else arrived, a message buried inside a comment thread on a forgotten mapping forum I hadn't visited in years. The post was generic, something about outdated cartographic projections, but one reply stood out. Owen, if you're still seeing things, check the 1993 Canadian archive. Look for missing frame 2E17. No username, no timestamp, just the words. I searched the archive out of instinct. It was raw footage from a topographic survey team operating in southern Peru. Same region, same elevation. The footage was clean, ordinary even, until it hit frame 217. Then it skipped. A single frame gap, invisible to casual viewers but clear to anyone who cared enough to check the index. I isolated it, dumped the footage frame by frame, and found what I hadn't expected. A structure, circular, dark, geometric, visible only for that instant, centered perfectly in the frame. On the next frame, it was gone, as if it had never been there. I watched it loop for hours. I couldn't explain it. The geometry didn't
match Incan or pre-Incan construction. It was too smooth, too exact. The shadows didn't match the lighting. Something about it felt off, like it wasn't part of the landscape, but inserted over it. I cross-referenced the coordinates with recent satellite images. Nothing, no traces. The land was barren, but one detail stuck with me.
The location had a strange history of satellite blackouts, exactly every 10 years, beginning in 1983. I charted them, and sure enough, each blackout aligned with periods of heightened solar activity. Not local, global. It wasn't just a pattern. It was a cycle, and buried deep in the metadata of the footage was a string of digits, annotated in faded typewriter font, USAF 47 Discon. A designation, maybe. A project. I didn't know what it meant yet, but I recognized the last part. Discon wasn't a word. It was a label. Discontinuity. Something that had once existed and was no longer supposed to. I found the pilot's blog by accident. I'd been searching the Discon term across military archives and decommissioned web indexes, most of it noise, until a buried redirect landed me on a Dead GeoCities page from 2002. The post was short, written by someone calling himself Ref 914763, and titled Lines of Sight. He claimed to have flown reconnaissance during Cold War surveillance ops in South America, specifically tasked with thermal imaging above the Nazca Plateau. According to him, they were instructed not to file flight logs during certain orbits. Just record, no questions. He described formations of light descending vertically above the glyphs, tight, controlled, symmetrical, and vanishing just before visual contact. The entries were vague, cautious, likely redacted even before being uploaded, but one line stood out. We weren't surveilling, we were rehearsing. The lines weren't for us to interpret. They were landing instructions.
Timing cues. I traced the pilot's initials and badge ID through a defunct pension registry. Took me hours, but I found a match.
David R. Hoyle, Royal Air Force. Discharged in 1976, committed to a private facility in Lancashire in 1998. I called, claimed I was a historian researching early surveillance methods. The voice on the other end hesitated, then said I could visit on the condition I didn't bring any recording devices. I took the next flight out. The clinic was small and quiet, perched on the edge of a coastal cliff. Hoyle looked older than his records suggested, frail, almost skeletal, but alert. He stared
at me for a long time before speaking. They told us the lights were meteorological, but meteors don't form triangles, they don't hover. He pulled a small box from under his blanket and handed it to me. Inside was a VHS tape, unlabeled. Canadian Mapping Crew, 1993. I shouldn't have it. But if you've seen them,
Then it's time you did. I asked why no one had ever digitized the tape. Hoyle smiled without humor. They did, but the copies always came back blank. Something in the signal didn't want to translate, so I kept the original. Analog was the only thing that held. The footage was grainy, time-stamped August 12th, 1993. Aerial survey, standard altitude, long stretches of desert framed by jittery rotor noise. For the first few minutes it looked normal, typical grid scan from a low-altitude helicopter. Then the pilot's voice cut in. Calm Canadian accent. You seeing that? The camera swung left, adjusted focus, and locked onto a cluster of dark, angular shapes in the sand. They weren't ruins or natural rock formations. These were too precise, sharp corners, perfect alignment. There were at least 7 structures, each forming points in a rough circle equidistant from a central depression. Then the footage stuttered. For 1 frame, maybe 2, the circle vanished. No fade out, just gone. The next frame showed empty desert. Same position, same shadows, but no structures. The pilot didn't react. Neither did the camera operator. I rewound it a dozen times. It wasn't a glitch. The tape continued with more flyovers, shifting light patterns and changes in thermal. Readings, though this was a visual scan. I paused on a wide shot. At the exact center of the circle, the sand formed a shallow spiral. Not a crater, but a kind of imprint, like pressure had been applied from above. The coordinates in the lower corner matched the serpent glyph I'd scanned weeks earlier. I felt cold. These weren't new formations. They were old, possibly ancient, and they had reappeared. I searched for geological markers in the shot, ridge,
lines, erosion patterns, then compared them to modern satellite feeds. What I found made my stomach turn. The terrain no longer matched. The spiral, the depression, even the alignment of the dunes. All gone.
As if the land had been reshaped, smoothed over. It wasn't erosion. It was artificial. Someone had covered it. I stopped going outside. The more I analyzed the footage, the clearer it became. These glyphs weren't decorative or ceremonial. They were designed. Each one followed a pattern, not just in shape, but in thermodynamic behavior. Heat signatures didn't radiate randomly. They pulsed in cycles, always aligned with solstices or solar maxima. I mapped them frame by frame, cross-referenced their coordinates with military satellite data, and found another disturbing pattern. Surveillance satellites, both civilian and classified, systematically avoided the Nazca Plateau every 10 years. Not one pass, not one shadow, as if something had rewritten their flight schedules. I checked orbital archives going back 5 decades. The gaps were deliberate. Someone didn't want this region watched during specific windows. Then I found internal documents from a decommissioned geospatial contractor, the kind of files left, on unsecured backup servers. Embedded in one report was a clinical term I'd never heard before, pattern delusion syndrome. It described field analysts who developed obsessive behaviors after repeated exposure to anomalous satellite data. Symptoms included memory lapses, directional disorientation, paranoia, and an uncontrollable urge to draw symbols. There were names attached: technicians, surveyors, a couple of drone operators. Every one of them had vanished into psychiatric facilities within weeks of diagnosis. Some were later removed from public records entirely. My hands were shaking. when I realized I'd been drawing. A full page covered in overlapping glyphs sat beside my keyboard, shapes I didn't remember sketching. I reached for my phone to call someone, but I stopped. Who? Everyone I'd once trusted was gone. My girlfriend had left weeks earlier, terrified by the changes in me. She said I talked in circles, woke up screaming, lost hours I couldn't account for. She was right. I'd started recording myself at night, audio only, and on one file I heard myself whispering coordinates I'd never visited. I followed them on a map, middle of nowhere, but centered perfectly between 3 known glyphs, a triangulation point. I disconnected my internet, taped over my cameras, and moved everything to an offline laptop. Still, the files kept changing. Notes I hadn't written appeared in my folders, directions, corrections. At first I thought I was losing time, but the syntax matched decommissioned mission files I'd studied years ago. Someone had rigged my system to auto-complete from ghost directories long forgotten. But the patterns weren't random. They were building something. I leaked the footage at 3:12 a.m., the exact time the serpent glyph first appeared on my scan. I uploaded it to 4 platforms, mirrored it across, i.e. secure drives, and embedded the thermal overlays with verification hashes. I watched the views spike, then vanish. One by one, the videos were pulled, not flagged, not reported, deleted, replaced within minutes by polished debunking clips. Each one used synthetic voices, borrowed my drone model, mimicked my thermal overlays, and claimed it was all a simulation error. They even inserted fake footage with distorted timestamps that almost matched mine. Within an hour, search engines stopped returning my name. The blog post was gone. So was Hoyle's forum. I checked my own backups, half were blank. Others had been overwritten with files I didn't recognize, documents filled with random characters, but when I aligned the lines vertically, they formed glyphs. Not just ones I had seen. New ones. Variants. Instructions. That's when I stopped, hiding. If this was a warning, I had already ignored it. If it was an invitation, I had already accepted. I returned to the plateau alone, carrying only a paper map, a compass, and the last set of coordinates I had whispered in my sleep. The desert was quiet. Still. But not empty. As I stood on the rise, I saw it again. Fresh heat blooming in the shape of the serpent, visible only through the viewfinder of my discarded drone. Only this time it was moving. Slowly. Rotating like a dial. Aligning. I looked down at the sand and realized I had been drawing in it without thinking. My hands moved on their own, carving precise arcs, closing shapes, not compulsively, deliberately. I understood now. The glyphs weren't messages sent to the sky. They were seals, containment fields. They hadn't marked arrival. They marked imprisonment. And someone had been redrawing them over centuries to keep whatever was beneath the earth from rising. The codex had mistranslated the symbols for sun and guardian. They weren't the same. They never were. We had mistaken warnings for decoration. I folded my map and began to walk the perimeter. The glyph was incomplete. But somehow I'd drawn it before, in notebooks I didn't remember keeping, in margins of maps I thought were clean. I wasn't just part of the warning anymore. I was the one tasked with rewriting it. They paid me to shoot beauty spreads for a travel magazine. What I found was 6 stone heads staring into nothing on an island that technically doesn't exist. I was between gigs, broke enough to say yes without reading the fine print. Names: Will Mercer, freelance photographer, mostly landscapes and forgotten places, though lately I'd been shooting more invoices than images. The assignment was simple: remote historical landscapes for an exclusive feature. Hidden crown jewels of the Atlantic. Newfoundland, I was told, rugged, beautiful, forgotten. I boarded a rusting ferry at dawn, the kind of vessel that didn't have a website. The captain, grey-bearded and half asleep, never asked for ID, just waved me on. When we finally approached the island, it didn't show up on my GPS. Not as a name, not even as coordinates. Just open sea. And then it emerged, low, fog peeling back like breath on glass. No birds, no waves lapping the shore, just silence, like the island exhaled and held it. I stepped onto the shore with my camera bag and tripod. No signs, no trails, just rock, wind, and moss. And them. 6 monoliths, each at least 12 feet high, carved from dark, weathered stone. They looked vaguely human, heads, nothing more, but not stylized like moai or tribal totems. These were precise, proportioned, anatomically human. Their eyes were deep pits, and their mouths sealed shut, with no visible seams, the kind of detail that should erode with centuries of weather, but hadn't. I framed my first wide shot and launched the drone, but the moment it crossed some invisible perimeter near the heads, it dropped like a rock. No wind, no impact warning, just gone. I climbed the ridge to retrieve it and saw something strange. The drone wasn't shattered. It had landed clean, almost placed, like something had caught it. That night I camped inland, but I couldn't stop thinking about the heads. I stared at the photos on my DSLR. 5 shots in, my stomach dropped. In one frame, there was a 7th head. Same weathering, same scale, perfect alignment. I'd walked that path, I was certain. There had only been 6. I closed the laptop, but that one image, it felt like a fingerprint pressed into my brain. I should have left then, but it was already too late. Something had noticed me noticing.
I didn't sleep. I lay in my tent, fully clothed, listening for sounds I couldn't name. The fog had rolled in heavier than before, pressing against the nylon like wet cloth. I kept telling myself the 7th head was a trick of light, maybe an angle I hadn't noticed.
But when I checked the timestamp again, the gap between the 6th and 7th photo was less than a second. No movement, no blur, just 6 heads in one, 7 in the next. And it wasn't just added, it was centered, like it had always been there. I packed before sunrise, ignoring the burning behind my eyes. The boat wasn't due for another 2 days, but I needed answers before I convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. I hiked to the north ridge where the heads stood. They hadn't moved, not visibly, but something felt off. The air buzzed, faintly, like the hum of old power lines. My phone's compass spun slowly, even with location services off. I circled the formation, taking wide-angle shots from every angle, then paused near the largest one. There was moss along the base, but under it, barely visible, were shallow carvings. Straight lines, perfect symmetry. One set of markings curved into something almost readable, Latin maybe. Half buried, only 2 words I could make out. Capita, something. I made a note, thinking it was part of some dedication long eroded by time. I pulled out a soft brush from my kit and started clearing the surface. After 10 minutes, the full outline emerged, a brass plate about the size of a laptop, fused directly into the stone. No bolts, no welds. The metal wasn't tarnished like it should have been. It almost glowed in the overcast light. I didn't touch it. Not yet. I just photographed it from every angle. Then I marked the GPS coordinates on my camera. My phone was still useless. I backed away slowly, checking the other heads. None had the plate. Only one? The same one I'd seen added in that seventh frame. That's when I knew I hadn't imagined it. Whatever that head was, it wasn't stone. It wasn't part of the island's history. It was placed, recently or intentionally. The fog thickened again, as if reacting to my thoughts. I slung the camera over my shoulder and turned back toward camp. That plate hadn't been exposed before. Something wanted it found. By midday, the fog had lifted just enough to make the shoreline visible. I kept my tent up but stayed outside, pacing between the ridge and the tree line. I needed a signal, anything to send the photos out. My sat phone was no help. It refused to connect. The bars flickered once, then vanished. I tried emailing the images through my laptop's offline client, hoping they'd queue up and send when I reached a signal again.
Then I heard it, a low mechanical whine, subtle but constant, coming from the ridge. I followed the sound back to the brass plate. It wasn't humming. The stone beneath it was. I crouched close, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound was
faint but rhythmic, like a slow, uneven pulse. I placed my hand gently on the moss-covered base beside the plate. The stone was warm, not sun-warmed, but internally heated. Natural rock didn't do that, not in this climate. I took more photos, switched to video, and recorded the audio. When I reviewed the footage on the camera's screen, the hum was missing. Dead silence. I replayed it twice, but the microphone hadn't picked it up. I tried recording it on my phone instead. Same result. My ears heard it, but the devices didn't. That evening, I set up a small perimeter using motion sensors and tripwires from my backup gear. I hadn't planned on needing them for anything more than wildlife, but something about the island felt wrong. I kept my camera ready and stayed awake, sitting just outside the tent flap with a headlamp and a notepad. Around 2 a.m., one of the sensors triggered. No wind, no rain. Just the soft chime from the receiver clipped to my belt. I stepped out, shining my light toward the ridge. Nothing moved, but when I checked the camera logs, a new photo had been added, unprompted. Time stamped at 2:03. It showed the seventh head again, now angled slightly. Its position had changed by degrees, just enough to notice. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. Not because of fear, but because I knew then that I hadn't just found something old. I had entered something still working, something watching, back. By morning, I had the photo printed and laid it side by side with the earlier shots. The angle of the seventh head had shifted. Its chin was lower, eyes tilted slightly toward the east. It wasn't an illusion. The light source and shadows were consistent. I didn't mention it in the notes I later tried to send, just attached. The files labeled the changes as geological instability. But by the time I hiked to the bluff and checked the heads again, the seventh had returned to its original position. It looked identical to the others, silent, motionless, eroded by time. But I no longer believed it belonged there. I returned to camp and powered up the sat phone again. Still no signal. I packed quickly and headed toward the East Ridge, where I'd first gotten a weak bar the day I arrived. It took over an hour of climbing, but eventually a single bar appeared. I sent 5 emails, 1 to my editor, 2 to trusted colleagues, and the rest to backup accounts I rarely used. All included the image of the brass plate and the night photo with the altered head. 1 bounced back immediately. The rest disappeared into the queue. No confirmation. I waited 15 minutes, then shut the phone off. Back at camp, I reviewed the metadata on the photos. GPS readings were scrambled. Some showed the middle of the Atlantic, others zeroed out entirely. But one photo taken before the anomaly had a readable tag. I traced the coordinates and matched them against archived maritime maps. The island wasn't listed, not even as a hazard or reef. No name, no mention. I widened the search. Eventually I found a reference in a declassified British naval log from 1926. A survey ship recorded magnetic fluctuations near uncharted rock. The entry was redacted but included one intact phrase, Capita Imperi, the head's rule. That was the first time I saw the phrase in writing. Not on the plate, not in photos. In a file buried under decades of silence. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. I typed it out once in a blank document. Then I deleted it. Something about it didn't feel like language. It felt like a key, and
I didn't know what door it opened. By the second night, I'd given up pretending this was just another shoot. The emails hadn't gone through.
I confirmed it by powering the sat phone back on. No outgoing message history. The files were gone too. Not deleted, just missing. I hadn't connected to anything that could remotely wipe them. No cloud sync, no auto backup. But the photos of the altered head, the brass plate, even the soundless video, all of it was no longer on the drive. My hands were steady, but my thoughts weren't. Either the equipment had glitched or someone had interfered. I started copying everything to an analog notebook. Names, timestamps, sketches of the carvings. I didn't trust screens anymore. I made the hike back to the mainland the next morning. No ferry was scheduled, but I found a fishing vessel moored in a nearby cove. The operator was a quiet man named Dalton. He stayed silent most of the trip, eyes flicking toward the island in the mirror every few minutes like he was checking it hadn't followed us. Then, about 30 minutes out, he finally spoke without turning. "You didn't see them blink, did you?" I asked what he meant, but he just smiled at the water. When we docked, he handed me back my gear and said nothing more. The next day, I heard he'd drowned, his truck found submerged off the harbour road. I thought about the way he'd glanced back, over and over, like he already knew. I tried contacting Parks Canada through back channels. A retired official agreed to meet in a cafe off King's Road. He never introduced himself, just opened with, "They were never guardians. That's the mistake everyone makes." I asked who built the heads, and he shook his head. "No one built them. We uncovered them. The builders are somewhere else." He refused to elaborate, only handing me a photocopied journal entry. It was dated 1983, signed by a private diver, and described the discovery of a metallic structure beneath the seventh head, one embedded with symbols matching medieval alchemical glyphs. The diver vanished 6 months later. No search was ever launched. That night I found a small device clipped beneath my rental car. A tracker. It blinked once, then stopped. I left it there. Let them know I knew. I wasn't running anymore. I was going back. I returned to the island at night. I waited until just after sunset, when the fog began to settle low and the harbour cleared of watchers. I used a private Zodiac, small enough to avoid detection, fast enough to cut through the swells. The shoreline was darker than before. No stars, no moonlight. Only the faint shimmer of sea spray and the dull crunch of the boat grounding in the sand. I carried only what I needed: notebook, headlamp, gloves, and a small excavation kit. The tracker was still on my rental. Let them chase shadows. I made for the seventh head immediately. The air around it felt warmer, heavier. I knelt by the brass plate, clearing the moss and earth I'd left untouched days before. With gloved fingers, I traced the edge. No seam, but the surface had changed. What was once cool and metallic now pulsed faintly under touch, almost imperceptibly. It wasn't glowing, it was sinking. My heartbeat slowed to match the rhythm. I took a breath and pressed down. The ground gave slightly, just enough to feel movement beneath the topsoil. A square of earth shifted, then lifted. Beneath it was a panel, polished brass, etched with the same Latin phrase, Capita Imperi. This time it wasn't flush with the stone. It hovered maybe half an inch above the cavity it covered. No hinges, no supports. I slid the panel aside, slowly. Beneath it, a hollow space opened into blackness. The walls were smooth and dry, lined with veins of copper that pulsed like veins under skin. The air inside was stale but breathable. I lowered my light and saw stairs. Man-made, precise, carved in a material I couldn't name. I descended. Each step was slightly warm, not from friction, but from some internal heat. The passage curved gently, leading underground in a perfect spiral. I counted 23 steps before it opened into a chamber. Not large, barely 10 feet across, but every surface was covered in symbols, not painted, not etched, grown like circuitry from within the stone itself. In the center sat a single object, a sphere, matte black, resting on a cradle of copper rods. As I stepped forward, it shifted, not moved, shifted, as if noticing. And then I heard the whisper, not from outside, from me. I froze, my breath shortened, not fear exactly, more, like dissonance, like standing inside a song I couldn't hear but somehow understood. Every cell felt slightly out of phase. I stood still, watching the sphere. It hadn't moved since that first subtle shift, but the feeling in the chamber had changed. The air carried weight, not physical pressure, but a sense of presence, as if the room had become aware of me in return. My headlamp dimmed slightly, the battery still strong, but the light pulled inward, as if drawn into the walls. I approached the sphere carefully, one step at a time. The copper cradle beneath it vibrated softly, in rhythm with the hum I now recognized as matching the frequency I'd heard through the stone. My notebook's pages fluttered on their own, responding to something I couldn't measure. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small compass. It spun briefly, then locked in place, pointing not north, but directly at the sphere. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. As I stood before it, the whispers clarified, not in language, but in intent. The heads weren't monuments. They weren't warnings or relics. They were receivers, designed to channel something already here. Something not alien in origin, but older than any written record. A signal broadcast from deep beneath the crust, not from the sky, from the earth itself. The aristocrats who had visited the island in the 1920s, the diver in 1983, the Shell Corporation funding restoration efforts, they hadn't discovered the tech. They had unlocked it. Accidentally or by design, they'd reactivated a system built to communicate with something still dormant, or waiting, and now I had too. I left the chamber slowly, retracing each step, sealing the entrance behind me with the panel. When I reached the surface, the seventh head was gone, no trace, only the original 6 remained, silent and still. My camera wouldn't power on, my gear corrupted, but the notebook, handwritten, ink on paper, was intact. The whispers have faded now, but something changed in me that day. I understand things I can't explain, patterns, signals, intuitions that don't belong to me. The heads weren't watching, they were watched, and now I see who's watching.